Good evening. My name is Cole, and tonight's stories focus on missing people, ordinary individuals who vanished without warning, leaving behind unanswered questions and unsettling clues. These are accounts that start normal and slowly unravel into something far more disturbing. So get comfortable, dim the lights, subscribe, and let's step into these chilling stories of people who were here one moment and gone the next. Let's start with our first story, and this one comes from someone whose brother simply vanished into terrain that made no logical sense for an experienced hiker to explore. My brother went hiking and never came back. His phone last pinged somewhere impossible. I keep thinking about that morning when he left for what was supposed to be a routine day hike on a trail he'd done dozens of times before. Jake was the kind of person who never took unnecessary risks when it came to the outdoors. He'd been hiking since we were kids, knew how to read terrain, always carried the right gear, and never deviated from marked trails without good reason. That's what made everything that followed so impossible to understand. The trail he chose was a moderate loop in the Cascade Mountains, something he could finish in 4 to 5 hours, even if he took his time. He'd hiked it at least 20 times over the years, and knew every switchback, every viewpoint, every stream crossing. When he didn't come home by dinner, I wasn't immediately worried. Jake sometimes lost track of time when he was photographing wildlife or just enjoying the solitude. But when midnight came and went, with no word from him, I called the sheriff's department. The deputy who took my report asked all the standard questions about Jake's experience level, his mental state, whether he'd mentioned any plans to go off trail. I answered everything as thoroughly as I could, explaining that my brother was methodical about hiking, that he always stuck to his planned route, and that he'd never given us reason to worry before. The deputy assured me they'd start a search at first light and asked me to forward them the GPS coordinates of the trailhead where Jake had parked his car. Search and rescue teams found his vehicle exactly where he said it would be, locked and undisturbed in the small parking area at the base of the trail. Inside, they discovered his wallet and registration, but his hiking pack, water bottles, and emergency supplies were missing, which suggested he'd at least made it to the trailhead and begun his hike as planned. The first day of searching focused on the main trail and the immediate surrounding area, with teams hiking the entire loop and checking every side path, creek bed, and potential hazard zone. On the second day, the search coordinator pulled me aside and showed me something on his phone that made my blood run cold. Jake's cell phone had last pinged a tower at 3:15 in the afternoon, which lined up with when he should have been somewhere near the midpoint of his planned route, but the triangulated location wasn't anywhere near the trail. According to the cell tower data, his phone had been approximately 4 miles northeast of the main trail, deep in a section of wilderness that experienced hikers avoided due to its dangerous terrain and complete lack of marked paths. The area where his phone last pinged was a maze of steep ravines, unstable rock formations, and dense undergrowth that would be nearly impossible to navigate without specialized climbing equipment. There were no trails leading toward that location from the main hiking route, and the terrain between the 2 points included several natural barriers that would have made travel extremely difficult and time-consuming. Most importantly, there was absolutely no reason an experienced hiker like Jake would have intentionally ventured into such hazardous territory, especially during what was supposed to be a routine day hike. Search teams redirected their efforts toward the ping location, but accessing the area required technical rescue equipment and took them the better part of a day just to reach the general vicinity. When they finally arrived at the coordinates, they found no trace of Jake or his equipment. The ground was too rocky to hold footprints, and the thick canopy of old-growth trees blocked most of the GPS signals, making precise location work nearly impossible. They searched for 3 more days in that area, using drones, search dogs, and ground teams, but found absolutely nothing. The lead search coordinator, a man with 25 years of experience in wilderness rescue, told me privately that he'd never seen anything quite like it. He said that in his experience, when someone's phone pinged in terrain like that, it usually meant they'd fallen from a significant height or had been carried there by something other than their own 2 feet. But there were no cliffs or elevated areas near Jake's last known location that would explain how he might have ended up in such inaccessible terrain. What haunted me most was the timeline. According to the cell tower data, Jake's phone had been moving steadily away from the main trail for at least 2 hours before it stopped transmitting entirely. This suggested that whatever had taken him into that remote area hadn't been sudden or accidental. He'd apparently traveled for miles through increasingly difficult terrain, moving farther and farther from any established trail or easy route back to safety. The official search was called off after 8 days, when teams had covered every accessible area within a 5-mile radius of both the main trail and the final ping location. The sheriff's department classified Jake as a missing person, and the case remained open. But without any physical evidence or credible leads, there was little more they could do. Family and friends organized additional volunteer searches over the following weeks, but our efforts were hampered by the same terrain challenges that had limited the professional teams. 6 months later, I received a call from a detective who specialized in cold cases involving missing hikers. He told me that Jake's case had been flagged in a database that tracked unusual disappearances in wilderness areas, and that there were several other cases with similar characteristics. People with extensive outdoor experience who had vanished from familiar trails, whose phones had last pinged in locations that made no logical sense, and who had left behind no physical evidence despite extensive searches. The detective explained that these cases often remained unsolved, not because of inadequate search efforts, but because they defied the normal patterns of how people become lost or injured in wilderness settings. He said that experienced hikers like Jake simply don't make the kind of navigation errors that would lead them miles off trail into dangerous terrain, especially not when they're familiar with the area and hiking in good weather conditions. That conversation was 2 years ago, and Jake is still missing. His case file sits in a drawer somewhere, classified as an unexplained disappearance, and I've learned to live with the fact that I may never know what happened to him that day. But I still think about that final ping location, about those 4 miles of impossible terrain between the trail and wherever he ended up, and about what could have compelled my careful, experienced brother to venture into such a dangerous area. The hardest part isn't just not knowing what happened to Jake. It's knowing that whatever did happen completely defied everything we understood about his character and his approach to hiking. This wasn't someone who took foolish risks or made careless decisions in the wilderness. Yet somehow, he ended up exactly where no rational hiker would ever choose to go. Our next story comes from someone whose father vanished from a trail so familiar it was practically his backyard, leaving behind only a single, perfectly folded piece of clothing. My dad disappeared on a trail he'd walked hundreds of times. The Riverside Trail was basically his second home, a 3-mile loop through mixed forest that started and ended at a small parking area about 10 minutes from our house. He'd been walking that same trail almost daily for over 15 years, first as part of his recovery routine after a heart attack, then simply because he loved the peace and quiet it offered. Dad knew every tree, every bench, every seasonal change along that path better than he knew the layout of our own backyard. On the morning he disappeared, Dad followed his usual routine. He had breakfast, read the newspaper, and told my mother he was heading out for his morning walk. He estimated he'd be back in about an hour, which was typical for his pace on the Riverside Trail. Mom was working in the garden when he left and waved goodbye as he backed out of the driveway. It was the last time anyone in our family saw him. When Dad hadn't returned by lunchtime, Mom called his cell phone and got no answer. This wasn't entirely unusual, since Dad often forgot to charge his phone or left it in the car during his walks. But Mom decided to drive to the trailhead to check on him anyway. His car was still parked in the small lot, locked and undisturbed, with his phone visible on the passenger seat. Mom waited another hour, thinking maybe Dad had decided to extend his walk or had stopped to chat with other hikers. But when the parking lot remained empty, except for his vehicle, she called the police. The first responding officer was familiar with the Riverside Trail and initially assumed this was probably a case of someone having a medical emergency or taking a fall somewhere along the path. He radioed for backup and began walking the trail himself, calling out Dad's name and checking every bench and rest area along the route. About halfway through the loop, near a scenic overlook that Dad particularly enjoyed, the officer found something that stopped him in his tracks. Folded neatly on a bench overlooking the river was Dad's jacket, not dropped or discarded, but carefully folded, as if someone had taken it off and placed it there intentionally. The bench was one of Dad's favourite spots to rest and watch the water, so finding his jacket there might have seemed normal under different circumstances. But it was a cool morning in early spring, and Dad never would have removed his jacket voluntarily, especially not to leave it behind on a bench. Search and rescue teams arrived within 2 hours and began a systematic search of the entire trail system and surrounding forest. They found no other trace of Dad anywhere along the 3-mile loop or in any of the adjacent areas. There were no signs of a struggle near the bench where his jacket was found, no broken branches or disturbed vegetation, and no indication that Dad had left the established trail either voluntarily or involuntarily. What made the discovery even stranger was the condition of the jacket itself. When the search coordinator examined it more closely, he found that it had been folded with an almost military precision that didn't match Dad's usual casual approach to organising his belongings. The jacket was completely dry, despite a light drizzle that had fallen earlier that morning, and it showed no signs of being worn through brush or having caught on any branches during the walk. Search dogs were brought in on the second day, and they were able to pick up Dad's scent along the main trail, up to the point where his jacket was found. But at the bench, the trail went cold. The dogs circled the area repeatedly, clearly detecting Dad's scent on the jacket in the immediate vicinity, but they couldn't pick up any trail leading away from that location in any direction. It was as if Dad had simply vanished from that spot without taking another step. The search expanded to cover a 2-mile radius around the bench, including steep areas down toward the river and dense forest sections that weren't accessible from the main trail. Divers searched the river itself, though the current wasn't strong enough to carry someone very far, and the water was shallow enough that a body would have been easily visible from the bank. After 5 days of intensive searching, with no additional evidence found, the official search was scaled back to periodic checks of the area. Dad's case was investigated as a missing person, and detectives interviewed everyone who regularly used the Riverside Trail to see if anyone had noticed anything unusual that morning. Several people remembered seeing Dad on previous walks and described him as friendly and predictable in his routine, but no one recalled seeing him on the day he disappeared. The trail had been relatively empty that morning, due to the overcast weather and cool temperatures. The detective assigned to Dad's case told us that the folded jacket was one of the most puzzling pieces of evidence he'd encountered in his career. He said that in cases where people had medical emergencies or accidents, clothing was typically found scattered or in disarray, not carefully arranged. The precision of the folding suggested a deliberate action, but there was no logical explanation for why Dad would have removed his jacket and folded it so carefully, especially if he'd been experiencing some kind of distress. 3 years have passed since Dad disappeared, and the Riverside Trail has become a place our family can no longer visit. Mom drives past the entrance sometimes on her way to town, but she's never been able to bring herself to walk the path again. The bench where Dad's jacket was found has become an unofficial memorial, with other regular trail users occasionally leaving flowers or small tokens in his memory. The case officially remains open, but there have been no new leads or developments since those first few days of intensive searching. Dad simply walked onto a trail he knew better than anywhere else in the world and vanished, leaving behind only a perfectly folded jacket and a mystery that has consumed our family ever since. The hardest part is knowing that whatever happened occurred in a place where Dad felt completely safe and comfortable, somewhere he'd walked hundreds of times without incident. Every theory we've considered falls apart when we examine the evidence. Dad was in good health, had no history of depression or suicidal thoughts, and had no reason to disappear voluntarily. The location where his jacket was found offered no opportunities for an accidental fall or injury serious enough to prevent him from calling for help. And the careful way his jacket was folded suggests a level of deliberation that doesn't fit with any emergency scenario we can imagine. The mystery of that perfectly folded jacket on a bench along a familiar trail continues to haunt us. A tangible reminder that sometimes people can vanish completely from the places where they should have been safest. Dad's disappearance taught us that even the most familiar paths can hold secrets we never anticipated. Now let's hear from someone whose friend vanished during what should have been a simple day hike, leaving behind all his gear but no trace of himself. My friend vanished during a day hike, and his gear was found scattered in a tight radius, but he wasn't anywhere near it. Marcus and I had been hiking together for about 3 years, and we'd developed a pretty solid routine for our weekend adventures. We picked moderately challenging trails, pack light but smart, and always stick together on the more technical sections. The day Marcus disappeared, we were tackling a trail we'd researched thoroughly, a well-marked 8-mile loop that was rated as moderate difficulty, with good reviews from other hikers. We started early that morning, around 7:30, and made good time for the first few miles. Marcus was in great spirits, pointing out interesting rock formations and taking photos of the wildflowers that were just starting to bloom along the trail. We'd hiked together enough times that I knew his pace and his habits, and everything seemed completely normal as we worked our way up the gradual incline toward the halfway point of the loop. About 4 miles in, we reached a scenic overlook where we'd planned to take our lunch break. Marcus wanted to explore a small side trail that led to what our trail guide described as a better viewpoint, about a 1/4 mile off the main path. I was feeling a bit tired and decided to stay at the main overlook to rest and eat, while Marcus said he'd be back in 20 minutes after checking out the alternate viewpoint and taking a few photos. 20 minutes turned into 30, then 45, and I started calling Marcus's name toward the side trail. When I didn't get any response, I packed up our lunch and followed the side trail myself, figuring maybe he'd lost track of time or had trouble finding his way back to the junction. The side trail was well defined and easy to follow. leading through a grove of pine trees toward what looked like a rocky outcrop with views of the valley below. I found Marcus's gear before I found any sign of Marcus himself. About 3/4 of the way to the alternate viewpoint, scattered within maybe a 20-foot radius, were his hiking boots, his backpack, his water bottle, and the camera he'd been carrying all morning. The boots were placed neatly, side by side, as if he'd sat down and carefully removed them, but his backpack was lying open with some of the contents spilled out. His water bottle was about 10 feet away, still half full, and his camera was sitting on a flat rock as if he'd set it down intentionally. What made the scene so disturbing was that there was no logical explanation for why Marcus would have removed his boots in the middle of a hike, especially on a trail with rocky terrain where foot protection was essential. His socks were missing, along with his other clothing, but there were no signs of a struggle or distress. The gear looked like it had been arranged rather than dropped or scattered by force. I immediately called out for Marcus, thinking maybe he decided to take a quick swim in a stream, or had some kind of emergency that required him to remove his boots. But there was no water source near where I found his gear, and no response to my increasingly frantic calls. I spent about an hour searching the immediate area, calling his name and looking for any trace of where he might have gone. I found absolutely nothing. When I called for help, search and rescue teams arrived within 2 hours and began a systematic search of the area around where Marcus's gear had been found. They brought in search dogs that were able to pick up Marcus's scent from his boots and backpack, and the dogs tracked his trail for about 50 yards beyond where his gear was located. But then the scent trail stopped abruptly, as if Marcus had simply vanished into thin air at that point. The search coordinator told me that the dog's behavior was unusual and concerning. Normally, when tracking someone who had walked away from a location, the dogs would be able to follow the scent trail for a considerable distance, even if it became faint or difficult to track. But in Marcus's case, the dogs circled the area where the trail ended, clearly agitated and confused, but unable to pick up any trace of his scent beyond that specific point. Search teams expanded their efforts to cover a 2-mile radius around the gear location, using both ground teams and helicopters to scan the surrounding forest and any potential hazard areas. They searched for 4 days straight, covering every accessible area and checking every ravine, creek bed, and dense brush section where someone might have become trapped or injured. Despite the intensive effort, they found no additional trace of Marcus anywhere in the surrounding wilderness. The investigation revealed no evidence of foul play or any indication that Marcus had been planning to disappear voluntarily. His wallet and car keys were still in his backpack, along with emergency supplies and a detailed itinerary of our planned route. There was nothing in his recent behavior and personal life that suggested he was experiencing any kind of crisis or had any reason to vanish intentionally. What haunted me most about finding Marcus's gear was how deliberately arranged it seemed. The careful placement of his boots, the way his camera was positioned on the rock, even the way his backpack was open, suggested that whatever had happened wasn't sudden or accidental. It looked like Marcus had stopped, removed his gear systematically, and then continued on foot into terrain that would have been extremely difficult to navigate without proper footwear. The case remained open for over a year, with periodic searches conducted whenever new tips or potential sightings were reported. But none of the leads ever produced any concrete evidence, and Marcus's disappearance joined the growing list of unexplained vanishings in wilderness areas. The trail where we were hiking that day has been searched multiple times by different teams, but no additional evidence has ever been found. I've never been able to return to that trail, or even to that general area of the mountains. The image of Marcus's boots sitting neatly side by side in the middle of nowhere, with no trace of their owner anywhere nearby, is something I'll never be able to forget. The search dog's behavior that day still bothers me too. The way they seemed to lose all sense of direction at that one specific spot, as if Marcus's trail had been intentionally erased or obscured. Marcus's family eventually held a memorial service, but his case officially remains an open missing person investigation. The detective assigned to the case told me that Marcus's disappearance fit a pattern of similar vanishings in wilderness areas, cases where experienced hikers simply vanished without leaving any logical trail or evidence behind. But knowing that others had experienced similar mysteries didn't make Marcus's absence any easier to accept. The gear we found that day was returned to Marcus's family, but I've often wondered what might have been captured on his camera if we'd been able to find it immediately. The last photos on the memory card showed normal hiking scenes from earlier that morning. Nothing unusual or concerning, just Marcus documenting another day in the mountains that had started out so perfectly normal. But carefully arranged gear in the middle of nowhere continues to haunt me. Marcus had simply walked ahead on a familiar type of trail, removed his essential hiking equipment in the most methodical way possible, and then vanished completely. The precision of it all suggested intention, but the circumstances made no logical sense for someone who loved hiking and had every reason to want to return home safely. The most disturbing part wasn't just that Marcus disappeared, but that he seemed to have prepared for his disappearance in such a deliberate way. Those neatly placed boots told a story that none of us could understand, a story that ended with one of the most experienced hikers I knew walking barefoot into terrain that would challenge even the most prepared adventurer. Sir, that's absolutely chilling. The methodical way Marcus removed his gear suggests he was acting with purpose. But what could possibly compel someone to abandon their boots in the middle of a hike? The fact that search dogs lost his scent so abruptly adds another layer of impossibility to an already baffling case. It's like Marcus was following some kind of invisible instructions that only made sense to him. The precision of his actions feels almost ritualistic, as if he was preparing for something specific. Whatever happened in those woods that day defied every logical explanation for how experienced hikers behave in wilderness settings. Marcus's story reminds us that sometimes the most unsettling mysteries are the ones where the victim seems to have participated willingly in their own disappearance. Let's move on to a story from someone whose son walked just a few steps ahead on a trail and vanished in broad daylight. My son walked ahead on the trail and was gone within minutes, even though we never lost sight of the path, and there were no cliffs or rivers anywhere nearby. Tommy was 8 years old and had been hiking with our family since he could walk. He wasn't the kind of kid who wandered off or ignored safety rules. If anything, he was overly cautious about staying close to us on trails, always checking over his shoulder to make sure he could see where we were. We were hiking a beginner-friendly nature trail in a state park we'd visited many times before. The trail was wide, well-maintained, and clearly marked, winding through a mixed forest with good visibility in all directions. It was the kind of place where families brought young children specifically because it was considered safe and easy to navigate. Tommy had hiked this exact trail at least a dozen times and knew it well enough to point out his favorite spots along the way. About a mile into our hike, Tommy asked if he could walk ahead to the wooden bridge that crossed a small creek, a landmark he particularly enjoyed because he liked to watch for fish in the shallow water below. My wife and I could see the bridge clearly from where we were walking, maybe 50 yards ahead, and the trail between our position and the bridge was straight with no side paths or obstacles. We told Tommy he could go ahead, but to wait for us at the bridge. Tommy started jogging toward the bridge, and we watched him make his way up the gentle slope that led to the creek crossing. He was wearing a bright red jacket that made him easy to spot among the brown and green colours of the forest. We could see him clearly for the first 30 yards or so as he followed the trail, moving at his usual energetic pace and occasionally stopping to look at something that caught his interest. I looked down for maybe 10 seconds to adjust my backpack strap, and when I looked up again, Tommy was gone. My wife was still watching the trail ahead and said she'd seen him just moments before, but now the path to the bridge was empty. We both started calling his name and picked up our pace, assuming he'd reached the bridge and moved out of our line of sight. But when we got to the creek crossing, Tommy wasn't there. The panic set in immediately. We searched both sides of the bridge, calling Tommy's name and checking every possible spot where an 8-year-old might have stopped to explore. The creek was barely ankle deep and slow moving, with no areas where someone could slip and be carried away by the current. There were no steep drops or hidden ravines anywhere near the trail, and the forest on both sides was open enough that we could see for quite a distance in all directions. We spent about 20 minutes searching the immediate area before my wife called park rangers while I continued looking for any trace of Tommy. The rangers arrived quickly and began a systematic search of the trail and surrounding forest. They brought in additional personnel and search dogs within the first hour, treating Tommy's disappearance as an urgent missing child case. The search dogs picked up Tommy's scent along the trail, up to a point about 20 yards before the bridge, the same area where we'd last seen him walking. But at that specific spot, the dogs became confused and unable to follow the trail any further. They circled the area repeatedly, clearly detecting Tommy's scent, but unable to determine which direction he'd gone from that location. What made the situation even more baffling was the complete absence of any side trails or alternate routes that Tommy could have taken. The forest on both sides of the main trail was dense enough to slow down an adult, let alone a child, and there were no game trails or informal paths that might have attracted his attention. The terrain was relatively flat with good visibility, meaning that even if Tommy had decided to explore off the main trail, we should have been able to see or hear him. Search teams expanded their efforts to cover a half-mile radius around Tommy's last known location, using helicopters, ground crews, and specialized tracking equipment. They searched for 3 full days, covering every accessible area and checking every possible hiding spot or hazard zone. Despite the intensive effort involving dozens of trained searchers, no trace of Tommy was ever found. The investigation ruled out any possibility of abduction, as there had been no other visitors on the trail that day, and no vehicle access to the area where Tommy had disappeared. Park records showed that we were the only family to check in for that particular trail that morning, and rangers had seen no suspicious activity in the area. The trail was also equipped with basic security cameras at the main entrance, and footage confirmed that no unauthorized persons had entered the park. Tommy's case became one of the most puzzling disappearances in the state park's history. The rangers told us that in over 30 years of operation, they'd never had someone simply vanish from such an open, well-monitored trail. Children had gotten briefly separated from their families before, but they were always found within a few hours, usually just out of sight around a bend or distracted by something interesting off the main path. The search coordinator explained that Tommy's disappearance didn't fit any of the normal patterns for lost children in wilderness areas. Kids who wander off usually leave some kind of trail, whether it's broken branches, footprints, or items dropped along the way. They also typically respond to their names being called, especially when they can hear multiple people searching for them. But in Tommy's case, there was no physical evidence and no response to the extensive calling and searching efforts. 6 months after Tommy disappeared, we received a visit from a detective who specialized in unusual missing person cases. He told us that Tommy's case had similarities to other unexplained disappearances in state and national parks, cases where people had vanished from well-traveled trails under circumstances that defied logical explanation. He said these cases often remained unsolved, not because of inadequate search efforts, but because they seemed to violate basic principles of how people move through physical space. That conversation was 4 years ago, and Tommy is still missing. His case file remains open, but there have been no credible leads or new developments since those first few days of intensive searching. We've never been able to return to that trail, or even to that state park. The image of that empty path where Tommy should have been waiting for us at the bridge is something that haunts both my wife and me every day. The hardest part is knowing that Tommy vanished from a place we'd always considered completely safe, a family-friendly trail where the worst thing we'd ever worried about was him getting his shoes muddy in the creek. The fact that he disappeared in broad daylight, on a trail we could see clearly, from a location with no hazards or hiding places, challenges everything we thought we understood about how the physical world works. Tommy was wearing that bright red jacket, moving along a straight, open trail toward a landmark he'd visited many times before. One moment he was there, visible and safe, and the next moment he was gone as if he'd never existed. The search dog's confusion at that one specific spot on the trail suggests that whatever happened to Tommy occurred in a way that even trained animals couldn't understand or follow. We've learned to live with the fact that we may never know what happened to our son that day, but we'll never stop wondering how a child can simply vanish from a place where disappearing should have been impossible, leaving behind no trace except the memory of a bright red jacket moving along a familiar trail toward a bridge he never reached. This story hits differently because it involves a child disappearing in what should have been the safest possible circumstances. The fact that Tommy vanished from a straight, visible trail with no hazards or hiding places makes this feel like something out of a nightmare. An 8-year-old doesn't just evaporate into thin air, especially not on a trail his parents could see clearly. The search dog's losing his scent at that specific location suggests something happened there that defies natural explanation. What makes this even more heartbreaking is that Tommy was following normal, safe hiking behavior by asking permission to walk ahead to a familiar landmark. His parents did everything right, maintained visual contact, and still lost their son in a matter of seconds on a trail where disappearing should have been impossible. Our next story comes from someone whose sister stepped away from a warm campsite and never returned. My sister disappeared near a campsite, and her tent was still warm when we found it. Emma had always been the responsible one on our family camping trips, the person who made sure everyone followed safety protocols and never wandered off alone after dark. She was 24 at the time, an experienced camper who'd been joining our annual trips to the same national forest since she was a teenager. Emma knew the campground layout by heart and had never given us any reason to worry about her judgment in outdoor settings. We'd set up camp that evening in our usual spot, a cluster of sites near a small creek that provided both water access and the soothing sound of running water throughout the night. Emma had pitched her tent about 20 feet from the main fire pit, close enough to stay connected to the group, but far enough away to have some privacy. After dinner, we'd spent a few hours around the campfire, talking and enjoying the clear night sky, before everyone started heading to their tents around 11 o'clock. I was in my sleeping bag reading by flashlight when I heard Emma unzip her tent around midnight. Through the thin walls of my own tent, I could hear her moving around outside, and I assumed she was making a quick trip to the designated bathroom area about 100 yards from our campsite. It was something she'd done countless times on previous trips, and since the path was well marked and she always carried a flashlight, I didn't think anything of it. When I woke up around 6 in the morning to start coffee, I noticed that Emma's tent was still zipped shut from the outside. This struck me as odd, because Emma was typically the first person awake on camping trips, usually up by sunrise to enjoy the quiet morning hours before the rest of us stirred. I called out to her tent softly, not wanting to wake the others if she was still sleeping, but got no response. After waiting another hour for some sign of movement from Emma's tent, I decided to check on her directly. When I approached her tent and called her name more loudly, there was still no answer. The tent was zipped completely closed from the outside, which would have been impossible if Emma was inside. When I carefully unzipped the entrance and looked inside, I found her sleeping bag and camping gear, but no sign of Emma herself. What disturbed me most was that the sleeping bag was still warm, as if Emma had only recently left the tent. Her camping gear was neatly arranged, with her clothes folded and her personal items organized exactly as she always kept them. Her flashlight was sitting beside her sleeping bag, still turned on, but dimmed from hours of use. Most importantly, her hiking boots were still inside the tent, which meant she'd left the campsite barefoot or in just her socks. I immediately woke up the rest of our family, and we began searching the immediate area around the campsite. We checked the bathroom facilities, the creek, and all the nearby trails, calling Emma's name and looking for any sign of where she might have gone. The campground host was notified, and within 2 hours, park rangers had arrived to begin a more systematic search of the area. The rangers found no footprints or disturbed vegetation that would indicate Emma had walked away from the campsite in any direction. The ground around our site was soft enough that footprints should have been visible, especially from someone walking without proper footwear. There were no signs of a struggle, no disturbed camping equipment, and no indication that Emma had left the tent involuntarily. Search dogs were brought in that afternoon, and they were able to detect Emma's scent around the campsite and along the path to the bathroom facilities. But beyond that established area, the dogs couldn't pick up any trail leading away from the campsite. They searched for 2 days, covering the entire campground and surrounding forest areas, but found no additional trace of Emma anywhere. The investigation revealed that several other campers had been in the area that night, but none of them had seen or heard anything unusual around the time Emma disappeared. The campground host conducted a security check around midnight and noted that all the sites appeared quiet and normal. There had been no reports of suspicious activity or unauthorized persons in the campground that evening. What haunted our family most was the warm sleeping bag and the flashlight still glowing inside Emma's tent. These details suggested that whatever had happened to Emma had occurred very recently, possibly within an hour or two of when I discovered she was missing. The fact that she'd left her boots behind indicated that her departure from the tent hadn't been planned or voluntary. The park rangers told us that Emma's disappearance was unusual, even by the standards of missing person cases in wilderness areas. People who leave campsites voluntarily typically take essential items like footwear and flashlights, especially if they're planning to walk any distance from their campsite. The absence of any footprint trail was also inconsistent with someone walking away under their own power. Emma's case remained an active investigation for several months, but no new evidence was ever discovered, despite extensive searches and interviews with other campers who'd been in the area that night. The campsite where she disappeared has been used by other families since then, but our family has never been able to return to that location or even to that national forest. The image of Emma's warm sleeping bag and glowing flashlight in an empty tent continues to haunt me 7 years later. She'd simply vanished from a secure campsite in the middle of the night, leaving behind all her essential gear and no trace of where she'd gone. The fact that her sleeping bag was still warm when I found it suggests that whatever happened to Emma occurred just hours, or maybe even minutes before I discovered she was missing. The warmth of that empty sleeping bag tells us that Emma had been there recently, but her complete absence of any trail or physical evidence makes it seem like she simply evaporated from inside her tent. The glowing flashlight felt like a beacon calling for help, but there was no one there to rescue. Emma's disappearance taught our family that even the most secure and familiar camping situations can become the setting for mysteries that defy all logical explanation. This story is particularly unsettling because of how recently Emma had been in that tent. The warm sleeping bag and glowing flashlight create this eerie sense that she'd just stepped out for a moment. But the complete absence of any trail suggests otherwise. An experienced camper doesn't leave her tent barefoot in the middle of the night without a compelling reason. The fact that she left behind her flashlight, which was still on, indicates whatever drew her away happened quickly and unexpectedly. The missing footprints make this feel less like a voluntary departure and more like something impossible happened inside that campsite. Emma's case shows how someone can vanish from what should be a completely controlled environment, leaving behind only the ghost of their recent presence. Our next story comes from someone whose uncle disappeared in a national park, where the rangers quietly admitted such vanishings weren't uncommon. My uncle went missing in a national park, where disappearances aren't uncommon, though the rangers would only admit that off the record. Uncle Ray had been visiting this particular park for over 20 years, first as a geology student researching rock formations, and later as a recreational hiker who'd fallen in love with the rugged landscape and challenging trails. He knew the park's trail system better than most of the seasonal rangers, and had served as an unofficial guide for other family members who wanted to explore the more remote areas. Ray had planned a solo backpacking trip for early September, a 3-day expedition along a series of interconnected trails that would take him through some of his favorite geological sites in the park's backcountry. He'd made this same trip at least 6 times over the years, and always followed the same basic route, camping at established backcountry sites and checking in with rangers as required by park regulations. His plan was methodical and conservative, exactly what you'd expect from someone with his experience level. On the morning Ray was scheduled to return from his trip, he failed to check out at the ranger station as planned. Park protocol required backcountry campers to confirm their safe return within 24 hours of their scheduled exit time, and Ray had never missed a check-in during his many years of visiting the park. When he didn't appear by late afternoon, rangers began trying to contact him on the emergency radio frequency all backcountry hikers were required to monitor. The first search team was deployed the following morning when Ray had been overdue for more than 24 hours. Rangers who knew Ray personally led the initial effort, following his planned route and checking the campsites where he'd intended to stay each night. They found evidence that Ray had reached his first planned campsite and had spent the night there, but there was no trace of him at the second site or anywhere along the connecting trail. At the first campsite, rangers found Ray's gear arranged in his typical methodical fashion. His tent had been properly set up and taken down. His fire pit had been safely extinguished, and the site had been left clean according to leave no trace principles. Everything suggested that Ray had enjoyed a normal first night of camping and had packed up the next morning to continue his planned route toward the second campsite. The trail between the first and second campsites was a moderate 6-mile hike through varied terrain, including some steep sections and a few creek crossings that could be challenging during high water periods. However, conditions had been ideal during Ray's trip, with clear weather and normal water levels throughout the park. The trail was well maintained and clearly marked, with no significant hazards or confusing junctions that might have led an experienced hiker astray. Search teams found no trace of Ray anywhere along the planned route between the 2 campsites. They searched for 5 days using ground teams, helicopters, and search dogs, covering not only the official trail, but also exploring every side path, creek bed, and potential alternate route that Ray might have taken. Despite the intensive effort, they found no equipment, no footprints, and no indication that Ray had traveled along any of the expected paths. On the 3rd day of searching, I had a conversation with one of the senior rangers that stayed with me long after Ray's case was officially closed. The ranger, who'd worked in the park for over 15 years, told me privately that Ray's disappearance wasn't the first unexplained vanishing they'd dealt with in that particular area of the backcountry. He said that over the past decade, they'd had 4 other cases of experienced hikers who'd simply vanished without a trace along similar remote trail systems. The ranger explained that these cases were never publicized because park management was concerned about the impact on tourism, and because there was never any evidence of foul play or systemic safety issues. He said the missing hikers were always experienced people who knew the area well, and their disappearances followed similar patterns of normal camping, followed by complete vanishing somewhere along well-traveled trails. Most disturbing was his observation that search efforts in these cases often produced no physical evidence whatsoever, as if the missing hikers had simply ceased to exist at specific points along their planned routes. When I asked the ranger what he thought was happening to these people, He said he'd stopped trying to develop theories because none of them held up against the evidence. He mentioned that other national parks had similar clusters of unexplained disappearances, always involving experienced outdoor enthusiasts who vanished under circumstances that defied logical explanation. The ranger's tone suggested he'd seen enough of these cases to be genuinely unsettled by the pattern, even though he couldn't offer any rational explanation for what was occurring. Ray's case was officially closed after 2 weeks of searching, classified as a missing person with no evidence of foul play. His family was told that the case would remain open indefinitely and that any new evidence would be investigated thoroughly. However, the ranger I'd spoken with privately told me that in his experience, cases like Ray's rarely produced new evidence once the initial search period had ended. The conversation with that senior ranger fundamentally changed how I viewed Ray's disappearance. Instead of seeing it as an isolated tragedy or freak accident, I began to understand that Ray had become part of a larger pattern of vanishings that park officials were aware of, but couldn't explain or prevent. The fact that these disappearances were happening with enough frequency to be noticed by long-time rangers suggested that whatever was occurring in that park's backcountry wasn't random or accidental. 3 years have passed since Ray disappeared, and our family still hasn't received any additional information about his case or about the other disappearances the ranger mentioned. The park continues to operate normally, with thousands of visitors enjoying the trails and backcountry camping opportunities that Ray loved so much. But knowing what I know now about the pattern of unexplained vanishings, I've never been able to visit that park again. The most disturbing aspect of Ray's case isn't just that he disappeared, but that his disappearance was part of a larger phenomenon that park officials acknowledged privately but couldn't address publicly. The ranger's reluctance to theorize about what was happening to these experienced hikers suggested that he'd encountered something beyond normal wilderness hazards or human behavior. Ray had become part of a mystery that extended far beyond individual cases of people getting lost or having accidents in the backcountry. That methodical first campsite, properly cleaned and abandoned according to Ray's usual careful habits, remains the last confirmed evidence of his presence anywhere in the park. Everything after that point is a void where an experienced hiker with 20 years of park knowledge simply ceased to exist along a trail he'd walked many times before. The ranger's off-the-record admission about multiple disappearances transforms Ray's case from an isolated tragedy into something far more sinister. It's chilling to think that park officials are aware of a pattern but feel powerless to warn visitors or explain what's happening. The fact that these vanishings specifically target experienced hikers suggests something is actively selecting people who should be least likely to have problems in the wilderness. Ray's disappearance becomes even more troubling when you realize it's part of a systematic pattern that authorities acknowledge but can't publicly address. The ranger's discomfort with theorizing about these cases tells us that whatever explanations they've considered are too disturbing to share with families. This story reveals that some national parks harbor secrets that go far beyond normal wilderness risks. Let's hear from someone whose friend returned from the wilderness but couldn't explain where he'd been for days that felt like hours to him. My best friend was found days later, but he didn't remember where he'd been and insisted only a few hours had passed. Marcus and I had been planning a weekend hiking trip for months, targeting a challenging but well-documented trail system in a mountain wilderness area about 3 hours from our city. Marcus was an experienced hiker with excellent navigation skills and a methodical approach to backcountry travel that had kept him safe during dozens of previous trips into remote areas. We'd planned to hike together for the first day, set up camp at a designated backcountry site, and then split up on day 2 to explore different sections of the trail network before reuniting at our campsite that evening. Marcus wanted to investigate a series of alpine lakes that were accessible via a day hike from our planned camp location, while I preferred to explore some rock formations along a different trail. Both routes were well marked and considered safe for solo day hiking by experienced backpackers. On Saturday morning, we hiked together to our planned campsite and spent the afternoon setting up camp and reviewing our respective routes for the next day. Marcus was excited about photographing the alpine lakes and had studied topographic maps of the area extensively. He planned to start early Sunday morning, spend the day hiking to the lakes and back, and return to camp by late afternoon so we could pack up and hike out together on Monday morning. Marcus left camp around 7 Sunday morning with his day pack, camera equipment, and emergency supplies for what should have been a straightforward 8-mile round-trip hike to the Alpine Lakes. I headed out about an hour later on my own planned route toward the rock formations. We agreed to meet back at camp by 5 in the evening, giving both of us plenty of time to complete our respective hikes and return before dark. When I returned to camp around 4:30 that afternoon, Marcus wasn't there, but I wasn't immediately concerned since he'd planned to spend considerable time photographing the lakes. By 7 o'clock, however, I was worried enough to start hiking toward the trailhead Marcus had taken, calling his name and looking for any sign that he might be having equipment problems or had taken longer than expected to complete his hike. I searched until nearly dark without finding any trace of Marcus, and returned to camp to wait through the night in case he was making his way back slowly in the darkness. When morning came with no sign of Marcus, I packed up essential gear and hiked out to the main trailhead to contact park rangers and report him as an overdue hiker. Search and rescue teams were deployed within hours of my report. The search for Marcus lasted 4 days and covered not only his planned route to the Alpine Lakes, but also expanded to include every accessible area within a 10-mile radius of our campsite. Search teams found no trace of Marcus anywhere along his intended path or in any of the surrounding areas. His planned route was straightforward and well-traveled, with no significant hazards or confusing junctions that might have led him astray. On Thursday afternoon, 5 days after Marcus had left our campsite for his day hike, a different group of hikers found him sitting beside a trail approximately 20 miles from where he'd started his Alpine Lake expedition. Marcus was dehydrated and mildly hypothermic, but otherwise unharmed. He was conscious and responsive when the hikers discovered him, though he seemed confused about his location and circumstances. When search and rescue personnel reached Marcus and began evaluating his condition, they discovered something that baffled everyone involved in his case. Marcus insisted that he'd only been hiking for a few hours and had no memory of the previous 4 days. According to Marcus, he'd left our campsite that morning, hiked for what felt like 2 or 3 hours, and then found himself sitting beside a trail he didn't recognize with no clear recollection of how he'd gotten there. Medical evaluation revealed that Marcus was suffering from dehydration and exposure consistent with having been outdoors for several days, but he had no injuries or signs of head trauma that might explain his memory loss. His equipment was intact, though his water supplies were completely depleted and his emergency food had been consumed. Most puzzling was that his camera contained no photos from the period after he'd left our campsite, despite his intention to document the Alpine Lakes extensively. The location where Marcus was found presented another mystery for search teams. The trail where hikers discovered him was in a completely different drainage system from his planned route, separated by difficult terrain that would have required advanced navigation skills and considerable time to traverse. Marcus had somehow traveled 20 miles through challenging mountain terrain with no memory of the journey and no logical explanation for why he would have chosen such a difficult route. Marcus was hospitalized for observation and underwent extensive medical and psychological evaluation to determine if his memory loss might be explained by injury, illness, or psychological trauma. All tests came back normal, and doctors could find no medical reason for his inability to remember the 4 days he'd been missing. His memories of events before leaving our campsite and after being found by other hikers were clear and detailed, but the intervening period remained a complete blank. The search coordinator told me that Marcus's case was unlike anything he'd encountered in 20 years of wilderness rescue operations. He said that people who became lost or injured in backcountry areas typically retained some memory of their experiences, even when suffering from exposure or dehydration. The complete absence of memory, combined with Marcus's ability to travel such a great distance through difficult terrain, suggested something far outside normal wilderness emergency scenarios. Marcus returned to his normal life after a few weeks of recovery, but he's never regained any memory of those 4 missing days. He's undergone additional medical consultations and even tried hypnotherapy to recover the lost time, but nothing has been successful in restoring his memories of that period. The experience has affected his confidence in backcountry hiking, and he's never attempted another solo wilderness trip since his return. What troubles me most about Marcus's case is not just that he disappeared for 4 days, but that those days seem to have been completely erased from his consciousness. The fact that he genuinely believed only a few hours had passed suggests that his perception of time had been altered in ways that medical science couldn't explain. Marcus had somehow traveled 20 miles through challenging terrain while maintaining no conscious awareness of the journey. The missing photographs from his camera add another layer of mystery to Marcus's case. He'd been excited about documenting the Alpine Lakes and had planned to take extensive photos during his hike. The fact that his camera contained no images from the period he was missing suggests that whatever happened to Marcus prevented him from following his original photographic intentions, even though he apparently continued hiking for days. Marcus's case challenges everything I thought I understood about how memory and consciousness work during wilderness experiences. The medical evaluations confirmed that he'd been physically present and active during those 4 missing days, but mentally, he seemed to have been absent from his own experience. It's as if Marcus had been operating on some kind of autopilot that allowed his body to navigate complex terrain, while his conscious mind was somewhere else entirely. Marcus's story is perhaps the most unsettling because he came back, but the person who returned wasn't quite complete. The 4 missing days represent a void in his existence that can't be filled or explained, despite extensive medical investigation. The fact that he traveled 20 miles through difficult terrain with no conscious awareness of the journey suggests his body continued functioning while his mind was elsewhere. His depleted supplies prove he was actively surviving in the wilderness, but his complete lack of memory makes it seem like someone else was controlling his actions. The missing photographs feel particularly significant since documenting the Alpine lakes was his primary motivation for the solo hike. Marcus returned physically intact but psychologically fragmented, missing a piece of himself that may never be recovered. Our next story involves someone whose brother's body was discovered in an area that multiple search teams had already thoroughly examined. My brother's body was found in an area that had already been searched multiple times by different teams. David had been missing for 8 days when a volunteer search group discovered his remains in a small clearing about 2 miles from where he'd last been seen. What made this discovery so disturbing wasn't just finding David's body, but the fact that professional search teams had combed through that exact location at least 3 times during the previous week. The clearing where David was found wasn't hidden or difficult to access. It was a relatively open area, visible from several directions, the kind of place that search teams would naturally focus on when looking for someone who might be injured or in distress. The first professional team had searched that area on day 2 of the operation. A second team with search dogs had covered the same ground on day 4. On day 6, a helicopter crew had conducted aerial searches that included direct visual observation of the clearing where David's body was eventually discovered. What made the situation even more inexplicable was the condition of David's remains when they were found. The medical examiner estimated that David had been dead for approximately 5 to 7 days based on decomposition, which meant his body should have been in that clearing when at least 2 of the previous search teams had examined the area. There was no evidence that the body had been moved there recently, no signs of disturbance in the surrounding vegetation, and no indication that David's remains had been concealed or hidden in any way. The volunteer who found David's body was a retired park ranger with 30 years of search and rescue experience. He told investigators that David's remains were lying in plain sight in the center of the clearing, positioned in a way that would have been immediately obvious to anyone entering the area. The volunteer was baffled by the fact that previous search teams had somehow missed such an obvious discovery, especially given the thorough nature of the professional search efforts. The search coordinator, who had led the official operation, was equally puzzled by the discovery. He reviewed GPS logs and photographs from all previous searches of that area and confirmed that multiple teams had definitely examined the clearing where David was found. He said that in his 25 years of leading search operations, he'd never encountered a situation where professional teams had repeatedly missed such an obvious discovery in such an accessible location. David's personal effects were found scattered around his body in a pattern that suggested he'd been in the clearing for several days. His backpack was about 10 feet away, partially opened with some contents spilled out. His water bottles were empty, and his emergency food supplies had been consumed, indicating he'd survived for some time after becoming separated from his planned route. Most puzzling was that his emergency whistle was found next to his body, unused despite the fact that search teams had been calling his name and using audio signals in that exact area during their searches. The investigation into David's death revealed no signs of foul play or unusual circumstances. He appeared to have died from exposure and dehydration after becoming lost and unable to find his way back to the main trail system. However, the location where he died was less than half a mile from a well-traveled trail, and the clearing was in an area that would have been easily accessible to someone seeking help or shelter. What haunted the search teams most was the realization that they had been within yards of David's location multiple times during the week he was missing. The search dogs had been through that area and had detected no scent trail leading to the clearing. The helicopter crews had photographed the area from above and seen nothing unusual. Ground teams had walked through the clearing itself and found no trace of David or his equipment. The official report concluded that David's body had somehow been overlooked during previous search efforts, though investigators couldn't provide any logical explanation for how such an obvious discovery had been missed by trained professionals using standard search protocols. The report noted that weather conditions had been ideal throughout the search period, with clear visibility and no environmental factors that would have hindered the search team's effectiveness. The family was told that cases like David's occasionally occurred in search and rescue operations, though the search coordinator privately admitted that he'd never seen anything quite like it before. fact that David had been found in such an obvious location after multiple thorough searches suggested either a systematic failure in search protocols or circumstances that defied normal explanation. 6 months later, we received a call from a detective who specialized in unusual death investigations. He told us that David's case had been flagged in a database that tracked anomalous discoveries in wilderness areas. He said there were other cases where bodies had been found in locations that had been previously searched by professional teams, always under circumstances that raised questions about how such obvious discoveries had been initially missed. The detective explained that these cases often remained officially unexplained because there was no evidence of criminal activity or cover-up, just the baffling reality that trained search professionals had somehow failed to notice obvious evidence during their operations. He suggested that David's case might be part of a larger pattern of discoveries that challenged conventional understanding of how search and rescue operations function in wilderness environments. 3 years have passed since David's body was found in that clearing, and our family still struggles with the implications of how he was discovered. The knowledge that professional search teams had been so close to finding him during those crucial first days, yet had somehow missed his location repeatedly, adds a layer of frustration and confusion to our grief. David had been lying in plain sight in an area where help was actively searching for him, yet he remained invisible until it was too late. The search coordinator's admission that he'd never encountered anything like David's case suggests that whatever happened during those search operations was outside the normal range of wilderness rescue experiences. The fact that multiple independent teams missed the same obvious discovery indicates something more systematic than simple human error or oversight. David's case taught our family that even the most thorough and professional search efforts can somehow fail in ways that defy logical explanation. The image of that clearing where David was found, photographed, and walked through multiple times by searchers who saw nothing remains a source of ongoing bewilderment. It's as if David's body existed in a state of invisibility until the moment it was finally discovered, hidden in plain sight from everyone who was actively looking for him. David's story represents every family's worst nightmare about search and rescue operations. The idea that professional teams walked through the exact location where he lay dying, multiple times, without seeing him, challenges our faith in organized rescue efforts. This wasn't a case of David being hidden or in an inaccessible location. He was lying in the center of an open clearing that search teams photographed and documented. The systematic failure to notice such an obvious discovery suggests something beyond human error or environmental factors. The fact that David had his emergency whistle but never used it, despite knowing search teams were nearby, adds another layer of mystery to an already impossible situation. His case proves that sometimes the most thorough searches can still fail in ways that make no logical sense. Let's move on to a story from someone whose mother vanished in the most ordinary of circumstances. My mom disappeared while letting the dog out in our backyard, and the dog came back alone, with the gate still latched. It happened on a Tuesday evening, around 8 o'clock, during what had been a completely routine day in our household. Mom had finished cleaning up after dinner and decided to let our golden retriever, Cooper, outside for his evening bathroom break before we settled in to watch television together. Our backyard was completely enclosed by a 6-foot privacy fence with a single gate that led to an alley behind our house. The gate had a spring-loaded latch that automatically locked when closed, and Mom was always careful to make sure it was properly secured after letting Cooper out. The yard was well lit by motion sensor lights, and from our kitchen window, you could see most of the outdoor area clearly. I stayed in the kitchen for about 10 minutes, expecting to hear the familiar sound of the gate opening and closing as Mom brought Cooper back inside. When the silence stretched on longer than usual, I walked to the kitchen window to check on them. Cooper was sitting by the back door, looking up at me expectantly, but Mom was nowhere to be seen. I called out to her through the window, thinking maybe she'd stepped into the garage or was checking something in the garden area that wasn't visible from my vantage point. When I got no response, I went outside to look for her. Cooper immediately ran up to me, tail wagging, clearly wanting to come back inside. The motion sensor lights had activated when I opened the door, illuminating the entire backyard clearly, but Mom wasn't there. What struck me as immediately wrong was that the gate was still latched from the inside. If Mom had left the yard for any reason, the gate would have been unlatched, or at least disturbed. I checked the latch mechanism carefully and found it was properly engaged, exactly as it would be if no one had opened it since Mom and Cooper went outside together just minutes earlier. I searched every corner of the backyard, thinking maybe Mom had fallen, or was having some kind of medical emergency behind the garden shed or in an area I couldn't see from the kitchen window. Our yard wasn't large, maybe 40 by 60 feet, with no hiding places or blind spots that could conceal an adult. The fence was too high for someone to climb over easily, especially for Mom, who was in her 60s and not particularly athletic. After searching the yard thoroughly, I checked the garage and the front of the house, thinking maybe Mom had come back inside through a different entrance and I'd somehow missed her. Her car was still in the driveway, her purse was on the kitchen counter where she'd left it, and her cell phone was charging on the nightstand in her bedroom. There was no indication that she planned to go anywhere or had left the house voluntarily. I called the police within 30 minutes of discovering Mom was missing. The responding officers were initially skeptical about the circumstances, suggesting that Mom had probably just stepped out briefly and would return shortly. But when I showed them the enclosed backyard, the latched gate, and explained that Cooper had been outside with Mom when she disappeared, their attitudes changed significantly. The officers searched the backyard themselves, checking for any possible exit points or signs that Mom might have left the area involuntarily. They found no evidence of forced entry, no disturbed vegetation near the fence line, and no indication that anyone else had been in the yard that evening. The gate latch showed no signs of tampering, and the fence was too high and smooth to climb without assistance. Search dogs were brought in the next day, and they were able to detect Mom's scent throughout the backyard and around the gate area. But at the gate itself, the trail went cold. The dogs found no scent leading away from the yard in any direction, as if Mom's trail simply ended at the gate without continuing beyond the fence line. The investigation expanded to include interviews with neighbors and a review of any security cameras in the area that might have captured unusual activity. Several neighbors were home that evening, but none had seen or heard anything suspicious around the time Mom disappeared. The house across the alley had a security camera that provided a partial view of the gate area, but the footage showed no activity during the relevant time period. What baffled investigators most was Cooper's behavior when Mom disappeared. Dogs typically become agitated or try to follow their owners if something unusual happens, but Cooper had simply returned to the back door as if nothing was wrong. He showed no signs of distress or excitement that would suggest he'd witnessed something traumatic or threatening. The detective assigned to Mom's case told us that disappearances from enclosed areas were extremely rare and usually involved evidence of forced entry or signs of a struggle. He said that Mom's case was unusual because there was no physical evidence to suggest how she might have left the yard or why she would have done so voluntarily, especially leaving Cooper behind. 6 months after Mom disappeared, we hired a private investigator who specialized in missing person cases. He reviewed all the evidence and conducted additional interviews, but reached the same conclusion as the police. There was no logical explanation for how Mom had vanished from a completely enclosed space with only one exit that remained locked from the inside. Mom's case remains open 3 years later, but there have been no new developments or credible leads since those first few days of investigation. Our family still lives in the same house, but none of us can bring ourselves to let Cooper out in the backyard alone anymore. The sight of that latched gate and the memory of Cooper sitting by the door, waiting to come inside, while Mom had simply vanished, continues to haunt us. The most disturbing aspect of Mom's disappearance is how ordinary and routine the circumstances were. She was doing something she'd done thousands of times before, in a completely familiar and secure environment, accompanied by our family dog who could have alerted us to any danger. Yet somehow, in the span of just a few minutes, she vanished completely from a space where disappearing should have been impossible. Cooper still goes to the back door every evening, around 8 o'clock, the same time Mom used to let him out. He sits there for a few minutes, looking expectant, as if he's waiting for her to appear and resume their routine. It's a heartbreaking reminder that even our dog can't understand how someone can simply vanish from an enclosed backyard, leaving behind no trace except the memory of a routine that will never be completed again. This is perhaps the most unsettling story, because it happened in such an ordinary, controlled environment. Mom didn't disappear in the wilderness or some remote location. She vanished from her own backyard while doing something completely routine. The locked gate from the inside makes this feel like an impossible puzzle where all the pieces contradict each other. Cooper's calm behavior suggests nothing traumatic happened. Yet Mom somehow ceased to exist within minutes, in a space with only one exit. The motion sensors and enclosed fence should have made this the safest possible scenario, but instead created the most baffling disappearance. This case proves that the familiar spaces we consider most secure might harbor the deepest mysteries of all. If you found these stories compelling, consider subscribing for more real and unsettling mysteries. Thank you for listening, stay safe, and as always, sweet dreams.